Hi guys, so last week I made a video talking about how often religion protects predatory men. And if you want to talk about the examples I gave and what I had to say about it, please go back and watch my video that I posted last week. And I just kind of wanted to do a little extension on that video because there are obviously many more things I want to say, but I think this one's a little important and something I left out that I probably would have included into my original video if I had thought about it beforehand. Um, in my original video, I said men in religion have been doing this for a long time and that it wasn't something new, which is true, but I should have included the fact that this has been, I'm not sure if I said this, but it has been part of it since the beginning because the men in the Bible do this. There are examples of men in the Bible who are predatory towards women, and it totally gets ignored slash swept under the rug and not even talked about in the first place because these are some things that I didn't even know until I went looking myself because it was never, ever, ever talked about in church. And I think there's a reason for that. I think there's an obvious reason for that. And there are two men that come to mind, and one of them I actually talk about a lot, which is Moses, and the other one being Lot. First, I want to talk about Moses. I talk about Moses so much because it really stung for me to learn about the dark side of Moses because I just grew up loving the Moses story and I was always so inspired by it. I was like, wow, he freed all these slaves and like he's such a hero and he did all these great things for God and he was so brave, blah 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 blah. I also grew up watching The Prince of Egypt, which fire movie. That's still a fire movie. The soundtrack is amazing. The animation is amazing. I love that movie. It's so good. But that's it's phenomenal, but that is besides the point. I was always painted this picture of Moses and that he was like he followed God. He was someone that God used for some amazing things, and he was chosen by God specifically to do these like heroic tasks. The biggest one being freeing the Jewish slaves in Egypt. So later on, when I was deconstructing, I was looking deeper into the Bible and learning more about the Bible. I was shook to my core to discover how dark Moses really was. And I was shocked to hear about how he talked about women and what he did when it came to women later in the Bible. And we are going to be talking about sexual assault and rape. And so we're going to be talking about women in that context. So in these verses, Moses is upset because they are getting vengeance on the Midianites. And Moses is upset because his soldiers brought back women and children. They had killed all the men, but they brought back women and children. And Moses was upset about this, essentially saying, like, this isn't right. This isn't what we should be doing. You saw what they did to basically our God, and, you know, they need to pay the price, whatever. But he says, kill the little boys, which, pause real quick. We're not going to go too deep into the fact that he told them to kill children, but whenever I bring this up, the funniest response I get from apologists, and I've gotten this response at least 5 times, is that it was okay that they slaughtered little kids because they were actually going to grow up to be serial killers. No, I'm not joking. I'm not joking, but all of a sudden the free will they care so much about goes out the window and they don't even realize it, or they don't give a shit because it's not like this stuff is ever cohesive, but whatever. Let's move on. Anyways, next Moses says, save the women and girls who are virgins for yourselves. Now, I've noticed in some versions of the Bible it says women and girls. I've noticed in some versions it just says girls, but it makes sense that it would be women and girls because they brought back children and women. They killed off the little boys, so obviously they're going to be children that are girls. So women and girls. He says to keep for themselves if they are virgins. So I'm going to be honest, I feel like a lot of apologists like to play dumb when it comes to this verse because I point out the most likely explanation of this verse, which is these women and girls became some sort of sex slaves or forced into sexual acts one way or another. And sometimes it feels so dishonest because apologists will say, you know, well, it doesn't explicitly say that. They act as if it isn't spelled out in black and white. It doesn't say that. But yet there are other things in the Bible that are spelled out in black and white that they say, oh, it doesn't really mean that. So the whole thing just feels really dishonest to me. But anyways, one explanation they give is like, well, they weren't talking about sex slavery. They were actually talking about marriage, which I'm sorry, it's kind of the same thing. Back then it was the same thing, because either way, these women and girls are not consenting to this stuff. And both of these things require these women to do sexual acts with these men that they don't want to do. Consent isn't even part of the conversation. So as far as I'm concerned, these are the same. I'm not saying they're treated the exact same, but it's the same as far as no consent and sexual assault, and it doesn't matter what they want. So yeah, you can call it marriage to make it sound better. You can call it sex slavery. You can call it making them concubines. It really doesn't matter to me what label you give it. It still leads back to the same conclusion. And some people deny altogether that when he says save these women and girls for yourselves, that it has anything to do with sex at all, which is very interesting, because why would you mention, like, you're specifically saving women and girls who are virgins? There's a reason that you're mentioning that, right? And like, what else would they be doing with these women and girls? Any other explanation doesn't make much sense. On top of this horrific realization that Moses gave these girls and women to his soldiers, I later saw in these verses that God actually says to Moses, he's talking about the spoils of war, and he includes the people in this, the people that were captured. And the only people that were captured and not killed were women and girls. So God is quite literally referring to these women and girls as spoils of war, and they are also listed along the cattle, the donkey, the sheep, along the other spoils of war. So it kind of shows you exactly how these women and girls are seen in the first place, which is property. And I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but it saves me a headache. Yes, I know during this time period that was common. And it really annoys me when people bring that up. They're like, oh, well, are you shocked because that's what happened back then? No, I'm not shocked at all. I'm talking about this as if the Christian God were real, and these men were real, and these events happened, and they're supposed to all be tied to this objective good. This is the context I'm talking about it in. So none of that shocks me. What did shock me as a Christian is supposedly God himself saying that, talking about women and girls that way, and then Moses supposedly handing over these girls and women to just men, say, have them for yourselves, and labeling or listing these women and girls with the other spoils of war, with the donkeys and the cattle, there being really no difference. I was absolutely disgusted by this. God is supposed to be beyond time and space, so why would he even command these barbaric acts of dividing the spoils of war? Because in this verse, he's commanding it. He's saying, like, you have to divide this stuff. And so he's not even just letting it happen. It seems very clear that he is commanding it. Divide the spoils of war, and this includes people. He is putting that label on people as property, because you're splitting up the goods, the spoils of war. And when I talk about this, I'm met with, well, that was normal in this time period. Okay. And that's irrelevant, because apparently God's morality is supposed to be objective. So why would God play along with the time period and partake in something objectively immoral? That wouldn't make any sense at all. An excuse that I've heard so often is God has to slowly lead them out of their sinful ways. Okay, so a way he leads them out of their sinful ways is by commanding them to do this stuff. What sense does that make? If you're commanding these barbaric acts, which includes splitting up people like spoils of war, how is that deterring them or leading them out of those ways? You're literally upholding the standard of these barbaric acts. So what? That doesn't make sense. Also, it doesn't make sense because there are plenty of other things that we could say were normal for the time, and yet God says don't do them. So it's quite obvious that God is very much capable of, even if something is normal for the time, telling somebody not to do it. On top of that, there are so many things in current day that we could say is normal for the time. Let's say casual sex, very normal for the time period we're in. So why all of a sudden is God saying we shouldn't do that? I mean, this is just the time period we're in. Why wouldn't he slowly lead us out of that? It's just like it's such a ridiculous explanation for it, honestly. It doesn't hold up in multiple ways. But anyways, this was very eye-opening for me as a Christian because I was never told about this part of the Moses story. And to me, it is very obvious as to why. It's hard to explain. It's hard to make sense of it. It's hard to make it seem good in any kind of way. Instead, he's painted like this man of God, this great man who freed the Jewish people. Him doing this to women was never a deal breaker. It never tainted his character and who he was in this story. And to me, it says a lot, and it so seamlessly translates into how Christians often do this in current day. And like I said, if you want to hear me talk about the specifics of that, you can go back to the video I made last week. But another thing that kind of drives me insane is when I bring stuff like this up, people like to say, God uses imperfect people to do amazing tasks. If I met a rapist, I wouldn't say, this is just an imperfect guy, guys. That's so, again, I feel like it is so incredibly dishonest. And also, God can't choose his main guys in the Bible. He can't find ones that aren't rapists. Like, that's too hard for him to do. It's absolutely so ridiculous to me and just absolute nonsense. But this isn't a one-off. There are more examples, but I'm going to just talk about one more example for sake of time. Lot is up next. Lot is another man painted as a man of God. All throughout my childhood, that's how he was painted. Again, just like Moses, none of this stuff I'm about to talk about was ever mentioned a single time my entirety of growing up in church or at home. So this man was supposedly, one of God's main guys, and that's why God sent angels to Lot to tell him to leave the city before he destroyed the whole city, because I guess at the time he was the only one worth saving from this city. This supposedly evil, wicked city that God was destroying. Interestingly enough, they were wicked due to sexual immorality. Yeah, make that make any sense. Anyways, basically God sends angels to let him know to leave the city, and an angry mob comes and demands that Lot hands over the two men, and so that they can basically sexually assault them. And Lot says, "No, please take my daughters instead. You can do whatever you want with them." So I want to get this right. The righteous man that God is warning to get out of this evil, sexually immoral city before it gets destroyed because he is a man of God, wants to spare him, he offers his daughters to be raped. He offers up his daughters to be raped. What? If this isn't the most contradictory thing I've ever heard in my life, I'm not sure what is. But so after this, we know that, they go to run out of the city, and these angels lead Lot and his family out of the city. And wife Lot looks back at her home being destroyed, and she gets turned into a pillar of salt. She gets killed. So I want to get this straight. Lot's wife gets killed, turned into a pillar of salt for simply looking back at her home being destroyed. But Lot offers up his daughters to be raped. And it's never talked about whenever the story is brought up, at least not in my experience. And I've talked to a lot of people about this. I hardly come across ex-Christians where they're like, "Oh yeah, my church talked about this part of the story." But him offering up his daughters to get raped is totally glossed over. Totally glossed over. Even if it is talked about, it's like, okay, next. Got it. It's just so... It says a lot that, again, Lot's wife deserves to get murdered and turned into a pillar of salt for simply turning around and looking behind her, but Lot can offer up his daughters to be raped, and that's fine. Even it's not even just fine. After the fact, he is still called and labeled a righteous man. And I felt so gaslit by this whole thing because growing up, I always had this picture of Lot's wife in my head as unfaithful and she was doubtful, and she just, like, she wanted to, I don't know, kind of this picture of she wanted to look back at sin and, like, still be a part of that or something weird. It was always Lot's wife was kind of painted in a negative light, and yet Lot wasn't ever. He was never painted in a negative light, which is just so incredibly crazy to me, because what are we talking about? Christians want me to read this story and feel equal in value to men. They want to convince me that this is how the Bible portrays men and women being equal. I've been told this so many times, of beyond just the sexism in the Bible. You know, they'll tell me we're equal but have different roles. And they want me to believe that the Bible actually preaches that men and women are equal. Meanwhile, stories like this are going on in the Bible, but they just ignore them. So them expecting me to believe that women and men are valued equally in the Bible, knowing what I know now and not just what they told me in church, that is a laughable joke to me. It is a joke to me. I do not take that stuff seriously, because there's just way too much there. And to me, it's the biggest form of gaslighting I've ever experienced in my life. It's like they just want you to roll over and accept it, instead of being like, wait, none of this logically makes any sense. You have to have some major cognitive dissonance to stick with that belief that they're seen as equal in the Bible, or you have to remain ignorant to these stories, which again makes sense that they wouldn't mention them in church, because then there's a higher chance of people remaining ignorant to these aspects of the story that make women seem like they are, you know, less valuable than men. Anyways, my point is, these things didn't make a single dent in these men's reputations from what I ever heard about. And again, I know there will be Christians that come in my comment section and say, well, they're imperfect people. It's a little more than that. If we're being honest, it is a little more than that. Come on, please be honest and say it's more than just being imperfect people. I've had enough of hearing that they're just so they're just imperfect. That's what I hear people say about Trump. Like, oh my God. I guess God is quite literally incapable of finding a man to do his work that hasn't committed sexual assault. I guess that's just like too hard. But also I want to point out the fact, when it comes to Moses, we all know the thing that did put a dent in Moses' reputation was that he smacked a rock. That was enough for God to punish Moses. How he treated a literal rock, the fact that he smacked it instead of speaking to it, had a more of an impact on him than how he treated those women and girls after that battle. If that isn't a clear message of where women stand in this religion, I don't know what is. I don't know what is. How you're treating an inanimate object versus a woman, a sentient human being, a girl. That's crazy. The abuse of women has never been a deal breaker in Christianity. Again, it isn't random that a lot of evangelicals elected someone who was found liable of sexual assault, on top of many other allegations from women. It's not shocking they accept Trump for who he is, because, you know, he's just a little imperfect guy. He's just an imperfect guy, you know? Like, we gotta get over it. This has been happening since day one. Since day one, this religion has ignored how many of these men treat women. Oftentimes in the Bible, God ignores it, or he condones it, or he commands it, like splitting the spoils of war, and the godly men in the Bible are partaking in it. It is just simply part of the religion. It has been there since the beginning. But then I have people willingly looking me in the eye and telling me nothing in the Bible is sexist. It's so crazy. Now there's so much more I want to talk about when it comes to this topic, but I'm stopping here. Let me know if you guys were ever taught about these two things specifically when it came to what Moses did and what Lot did to women. I'm very interested to hear, because I made a post about this the other day, and there were a lot of people in my comment section saying that they were never told this in church, they were never taught this by anybody within their communities, and Lot and Moses were very much painted as men of God, or like Lot was righteous, whatever. So yeah, let me know your experience. And I'm also interested, if they did talk about these parts, how did they frame it? Did they just say it as a matter of fact and was like, okay, that's just what happened next? Or did they explain it? And if they did explain it, how did they explain it? I'm very interested to hear you guys' experiences. I love reading your comments. But yeah, I'm interested to know. Yeah, at the end of the day, the sweeping the abuse of women under the rug isn't a fluke. It is indeed the standard, but that's all I have for today. I hope you guys are doing good. I hope you're taking care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.